The contact had been sitting on my scope for 31 hours when it finally answered us, and the answer was not words. It was a tone, 3 notes, descending, repeated 4 times. And the moment it came through my headset, I knew 2 things at once: that we were no longer alone in the Cinder's Gate system, and that nothing in 23 years of signals work had prepared me to file what I was hearing. My name is Marcus Reyes. I was Chief Warrant Officer aboard the Terran diplomatic frigate Long Patience, Signals Chief, 3rd Watch, and I want that on the record before anything else, because what I am about to tell you has been told wrong people who were not there. I was there. I was the man with his hand on the key, the tone repeated. Lieutenant Park, my second on the boards, looked at me with her cursor frozen over the logging panel, because there was no category for it. It was not radio, it was not laser. It was arriving on every band at once, including bands we monitored only out of habit, including a gravimetric channel that should not have been able to carry structure at all. Something out there was making space itself hum like a struck rail, and it was doing it gently, politely, the way you knock on a door when you already know someone is home. Log it as a hail, I said. Wake the captain. Captain Elena Marsh was on the bridge inside 4 minutes, uniform squared. No sleep in her face, though I knew she had been down less than an hour. She stood behind my station and listened to the 3 descending notes twice through, and then she said the thing I have thought about every day since. That's not a greeting. That's a summons. We had come to Cinder's Gate because of a signal. Everyone knows that part now. 8 months earlier, a survey drone on the rim of surveyed space had recorded a repeating structure buried in the noise of a dead star, a pattern too regular for nature and too patient for accident. The pattern, when our people unwound it, resolved into coordinates and a count. The coordinates were this system: a burned ember of a sun, one shattered moon turning around a planet that had lost its atmosphere a billion years ago, a place with nothing to want and nothing to take. Neutral ground, if anything in space can be called neutral. The count was a calendar. It said, in effect, we will be here on this day. Come. So humanity came, and here is the part the official histories smooth over, the part that matters. We came twice. What the galaxy was meant to see was the Long Patience, one frigate, lightly armed, painted in the white and slate of the diplomatic service, carrying Special Envoy Theodore Voss, the xenolinguist doctor, Amara Safu, a staff of 40, and a crew of 110, one small ship, alone at the rendezvous, holding a single candle up in the dark. What the galaxy was not meant to see had arrived 19 days before we did. They called it the Veil Squadron. 41 warships of the line under Commodore Ilsa Brandt, wedge-hulled destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers, the carrier Resolute Dawn, all of them running cold and silent under stealth doctrine that had never been tested against an unknown power, scattered through the system's debris fields in dead orbits like iron filings in ash. Aboard the Long Patience, exactly 7 people knew the Veil existed: the captain, the envoy, Dr. Safu, 3 officers in fire control, and me, because I ran the whisker laser, the hair-thin communication thread that was the only link between our lonely white frigate and 41 ghosts. I want to be honest about how that felt, because the feeling is part of the story. It did not feel like treachery. It felt like a man walking into a strange town with his hands open and his brother watching from the ridge. We did not know what was coming to meet us. We knew only that something older and larger than us had left a calling card on a dead star, and that every law of survival our species ever wrote said, hope for the best and stand ready for the rest. The tone on my scope changed at O2 horn ship time. The 3 descending notes became a chord, and the chord became a wall, and then the far side of the system tore open. I have read the official description, a localized spatial displacement event of significant magnitude, and it is accurate the way a death certificate is accurate. What I saw was the dark itself folding back like a tent flap, a seam of violet light 4,000 kilometers long, and ships coming through it the way whales breach. Not 5 ships, which was the figure our intelligence people had modeled for a diplomatic delegation. Not 50, 306. Park read the count off the array twice because the first time her voice didn't carry. I confirmed it myself, plot by plot, because that was my job, and because some part of me needed to touch each contact with my own cursor to believe it. 306 hulls, the smallest of them massing 4 times our frigate, the largest, a thing at the formation's heart that the plot software refused to classify, 11 kilometers from bow to stern, if those words even applied to it. They moved into the system in a slow spiral, all of them together, like a flight of birds that had decided to be a cathedral. And they were singing, that is the only word I have. Every hull broadcast a voice, and the voices interlocked. Tones answering tones across thousands of kilometers, harmonics stacked on harmonics. The gravimetric band carrying a bass line that made the deck plates of the Long Patience shiver very softly under my boots. My boards lit from end to end. I had monitored fleet traffic my whole career, clipped, encrypted, dry as bone. This was a fleet that talked to itself in music, openly, gloriously, as if encryption were a sin. Signals, Captain Marsh said. Tight beam to the veil, one word, hold. My hand was on the key before she finished the sentence. The whisker laser found the relay drone hidden in the shattered moon's debris ring, and one word went out to 41 warships sitting dark among the bones of the system. Hold. Do not move. Do not power. Do not breathe. Commodore Brandt's reply came back in 11 seconds, a single acknowledgement pulse, and I will tell you that those 11 seconds were long. Envoy Voss came onto the bridge while the Armada was still deploying. He was a heavyset man past 60. With a gray beard he kept too neat and a voice that never rose, and I had watched him for the whole transit out and not once been able to tell what he was thinking. He stood at the main viewport with his hands clasped behind his back and watched 306 alien warships fill the sky over a dead world, and what he said was, "Good, they brought everything. That means this matters to them." Dr. Safu was at his shoulder, already working, a portable analysis rig slung against her hip and her eyes moving across the signal waterfall on my repeater screen. She was the youngest of the senior staff, lean and quick and impatient with ceremony, and she spent 2 decades teaching machines to find grammar in whale song and seismic tremor in the flocking of birds, on the theory that someday her species would need to talk to something that had never heard of words. Someday was now on my scope, singing. The structure repeats at 7 scales, she said, half to herself. The same shape in the chord, in the phrase, in the formation pattern. Look, the ships are arranged in the same intervals as the harmony. The fleet is the sentence. They're not transmitting a message, they are the message. And what does it say? Marsh asked. Safu was quiet for a moment, watching the cathedral of Hull's wheels slowly above the burned planet. It says, this is our full voice. This is everything we are. I think it's a liturgy, Captain. I think we've been invited to church. The Armada finished its deployment at ZO 347 and went silent all at once. 306 voices stopping on the same beat, a silence so sudden and total that Park flinched at her boards. Then a single ship detached from the formation's heart. Not the 11-kilometer giant. This one was small by their measure, barely a kilometer. Hull the color of old pewter, surfaces flowing into each other without seam or rivet, as if the ship had been grown rather than built. It crossed half the system in 20 minutes and stopped, exactly, perfectly, at 100 kilometers off our bow. The distance, Sefu noted, was not arbitrary. It was the wavelength of their lowest gravimetric tone, expressed in kilometers. Even where they parked was grammar. Then it sang the 3 descending notes one more time and waited. Well, Voss said softly, it's rude to be late for the service. He turned to the captain. With your permission, Elena, let's introduce ourselves. The introduction took 9 hours, and I want to slow down here, not because the pace slowed, it never did, but because what happened in those 9 hours is the reason everything, after happened the way it did, and the histories compress it to a paragraph. I was on the boards for all of it. I heard every note. We answered tone with tone. That was Sefu's first decision and her best one. Do not send mathematics. Do not send prime numbers and hydrogen lines like the textbooks said. The textbooks had been written by people imagining radio telescopes, not a fleet that sang. The aliens had opened with 3 descending notes. Sefu sent the same 3 notes back, transposed into our cleanest transmission band, and then added 2 more, rising, an answer phrased as a continuation. An hour later, the pewter ship replied with our 5 notes woven into a structure of 40, and inside that structure the human notes had been corrected, retuned a fraction of a degree, the way you gently fix a child's grip on a pencil. They're teaching us, Sefu said. Her hands were shaking very slightly, and her face had the look of a woman who has stepped through a door she spent her whole life knocking on. The correction is the lesson. They sing, we echo, they correct. It's a catechism. By the 3rd hour we had nouns, or what passed for them, stable tone clusters that meant this ship, that star you we. By the 5th hour we had something like tense. And in the 6th hour, the pewter ship sang a long, patient, formal phrase that Sefu's rig chewed on for 30 minutes before she straightened up from the screen and read out the first full sentence ever passed, from an alien mind to a human one. We are the Vethari, she read slowly, checking every cluster twice. We are the choir that measures. You are heard. Present yourselves for the measuring. The bridge was quiet for a moment. It was Voss who broke it, and his voice had no surprise in it at all. Measuring, he repeated. Doctor. Connotation. Is that measure as in evaluate or measure as in music? Sefu ran the cluster again. Both, it's the same tone shape. To them there may be no difference. A thing's worth and a thing's place in the harmony are the same concept. Sir, there's a 3rd resonance in it as well. The same root appears in the cluster they use for rank. Worth, harmony, and rank, all one word. Voss nodded slowly, the way a man nods at a chessboard. So this is not a conversation, it's an audition. He was closer than he knew. We would learn, across those 9 hours and the days that followed, what the Vithari were, and I will set it down plainly here the way Sifu's team eventually assembled it, because you need it to understand what came after. The Vithari ascendancy was old, older than our recorded history by an order we never firmly established, and it was in every cell of its being a theocracy of order. Their faith had no temples because their ships were the temples, no scripture because the song was the scripture, sung continuously fleet to fleet, world to world, a single composition that had reportedly never stopped in 11,000 years. Their society was built in choirs, vast hereditary orders, each with its own voice line in the eternal song, and over the choirs stood the cantors, priest-admirals, and over the cantors a single office they rendered as the cantor of cantors, who held the keynote, the one true reference pitch against which every voice in their civilization was tuned. And their cosmology, the deep article of their faith, was this: everything that exists has a true measure, a fixed, knowable magnitude of strength and worth, and the sacred duty of every being is to sound its true measure openly, fully, and at once, so that it can be placed in the great harmony where it belongs. A thing that sounds its full voice is holy. A thing that sounds less than its full voice is not modest, it is lying. And a lie, in a universe built of song, is the only sin they had a word for. First contact for the Vethari was therefore not negotiation. It was a sacrament, the most ancient rite they possessed. They called it the rite of first measure. Two powers meet. Each, before anything else, reveals the whole of its strength, all of it, every hull, every weapon, every reserve, held back nothing, and sings it plainly before the other. The measures are compared, and the lesser power, in accordance with the harmony of the universe, accepts the place of the lesser voice, protection, instruction, and obedience. They had a tone cluster for that arrangement too. Sifu first translated it as guardianship. Later, when she had more context, she revised it. The word was tutelage, and it was not optional. We did not know all of that in the 6th hour. But Voss, standing at the viewport with his hands behind his back, had already smelled the shape of it, because Voss had spent 40 years in rooms where the pleasantries were a blade's length from the threat. When the pewter ship sang "Present yourselves" for the measuring, he did not ask Sifu for a polite delay. He asked her for the cluster that meant "we are here," and the cluster that meant "speak," and he had her weave them into the simplest sentence our infant grammar could carry. "We are here. We are listening. Teach us your right." It was, I came to believe, the most important sentence of the entire contact, and it bought us everything that followed. Because the Vethari, hearing it, did the one thing 306 warships are rarely inclined to do. They were delighted. The response came back in minutes, and it came not from the pewter herald but from the whole armada at once. The silence broke, and 306 voices stood up together in a chord that lit every band on my boards like sunrise. Sifu didn't need the rig for that one. "Joy," she said. "That's joy." Or no, approval. The way a teacher approves. The deck hummed under us. Somewhere aft, I am told, crewmen who knew nothing of tone lattices stopped in the corridors and listened to the hull itself murmur, and some of them wept without knowing why, and I do not think less of them for it. I had headphones on at the source. I know what it did to me. Then the Armada showed us what a measure was. They had chosen the venue with care, I realized later, a dead system, nothing to break, a shattered moon already 9/10 ruined hanging over a corpse of a planet. At the 7th hour, 4 of the great hulls detached from the cathedral formation took station around the debris ring of that broken moon and sang a working song, and where the song fell, the ring obeyed. 40,000 fragments of rock, some of them the size of cities, began to move, not shoved, not tractored in any fashion my instruments could name, but conducted, swept into lines and arcs, 100,000 tons of dead stone dancing in slow formation like a corps of ballet. They assembled the fragments into a perfect ring, kilometers wide. Then a 5th ship sang a single note, hard, and the ring ignited. Every fragment at once flashed to incandescence, a halo of white fire around the dead moon, bright enough that the viewport polarized to save our eyes. Park said very quietly, "That was a weapons demonstration." "That was the collection plate," Voss said. "Keep your seats, they were not done." The Armada's heart, the 11-kilometer hull our software would not classify, moved for the first time, advanced toward the system's burned ember of a star, and sang into it, and the star answered. A filament of its corona rose, a bridge of plasma 250,000 kilometers long, arched up out of the photosphere and held there, shaped, steady, a banner of star stuff hanging in the black for 1 full minute while the entire Armada held a single cord beneath it. Then they let it fall, and the star closed over it, and the system was dark and dead again as if the Vithari had never touched it. My board settled. My hands, I noticed in a detached way, were flat on the console and pressing down, as if the deck might leave without me. Around the bridge, I watched faces I'd known for 2 years find out what their owner's real ratio of awe to terror was. The tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Osi, had gone gray around the mouth. The helmsman was whispering something that was either a prayer or arithmetic. And here is what I want you to understand, because everything turns on it. Nothing about the demonstration was hostile. There was no menace in it, no posturing, none of the bared teeth theater that human fleets use when they want to frighten one another at exercises. The Vithari were not threatening us. They were worshiping, singing their true measure before a new congregation because their God required it of them, fully and without concealment, the whole of their strength laid open like a hand. It was the most honest thing I have ever watched a civilization do. Then the pewter herald turned its voice back to us and sang with the patient kindness of a bishop addressing a barefoot parish. Now you, sound your measure, hold back nothing. It is the law of the song, and 110 crew and 40 diplomats sat inside one small white frigate, with 41 warships lying silent and invisible in the ash of that system, and every officer on that bridge who knew about the veil very carefully did not look at anyone else. Captain Marsh stood up from her chair. I had served under her for 2 years, and I will testify under any oath you like. Her voice did not change. That woman's voice never changed, not then, not at the end. She crossed to Voss at the viewport and said, "Envoy, recommendation." "We tell them the truth," Voss said. Osi turned from the tactical station. "Sir, with respect, the truth is parked in their laps. If we reveal the veil after sitting on it for 9 hours, we've confessed to deceiving them inside their own sacrament, Doctor." "Sefu's word for lying, sir, it's their only word for sin. And if we don't reveal it," Marsh said, "we commit the sin in front of them and hope they never learn to count." Sefu looked up from her rig. There was something in her face I hadn't seen there before. The look of a translator who has understood a sentence faster than she can soften it. "There's a complication," she said, the herald's phrasing. "Sound your measure, hold back nothing. It isn't a request, and it isn't even a command. Grammatically, it's a rubric, a step in a ceremony that has already begun. As far as the Vethari are concerned, we entered the rite the moment we echoed their first 3 notes. We're not being invited to participate. We're standing at the altar mid-service. Then what happens?" Marsh asked. "To a party that stops the service. I don't have the tones for that yet." Sefu's jaw set. "But I have their word for a voice that won't sing. It's the same cluster they use for something dead." Voss was silent for a long moment, looking out at the herald, that seamless pewter shape holding its perfect 100-kilometer interval, and at the cathedral of 306 fire-capable hulls wheeling slowly beyond it. "And I will tell you what I believe he was weighing, because he told me himself, years later, over a drink neither of us finished. He was not weighing honesty against deception. That choice was already gone. The veil was a fact. Hiding it had been a decision made by a cautious species months ago and 40 light-years away. What he was weighing was time. A species that had never met humanity was about to define us by a single act, and once a first impression is made at that scale, he said, you do not get to revise it. You live inside it for 1,000 years. He turned from the viewport. "We sound a measure," he said, "a true one. We give them the long patience. Every system on this ship opened fully, exactly as their law requires. One ship, sounding the whole of its one voice, holding back nothing of itself." He paused. "And we say nothing about anything that is not this ship. Their rite measures the voices present at the altar. Very well. This is the voice that came to the altar." "That's a lawyer's truth, Theo," Marsh said quietly. "It was the only time I ever heard her use his first name on the bridge." "It's a diplomat's truth," Voss said, "and it is the only one on the table that doesn't end the service." "Doctor, translate." So humanity sounded its measure, and I was the man who keyed the transmission. We did it honestly, inside the boundary Voss had drawn. Sefu and I spent 90 minutes building the lattice, the long patience rendered into their grammar, voice by voice. Our drive output, our reactor's full throat, run up to red line at station keeping, so the energy was spent, but the singing of it was true. Our hull, our mass, our age. The frigate was 11 years old, and we sang that too, because their rite sang the age of every hull like a lineage. Our armament, such as it was, 4 defensive batteries, 2 torpedo rooms we had no intention of ever opening at anyone. Sifu insisted we sing the crew as well, 150 human voices aboard. And at her urging, in the last measure of the lattice, we did something that was not in the Vethari rubric at all. We sang names, not all of them. The grammar couldn't carry it. But the captain's name and the envoy's and the ship's own name rendered tone by tone long patience. The Armada listened to our little measure, a single frigate's worth of fusion and steel, after they had conducted a moon's bones and bridled a star in total silence. The silence stretched long enough that Park's knuckles went white on the edge of her console. Then the herald sang one short phrase, and Sefu translated it, and her voice caught in the middle. "It says, The small voice sings cleanly, she swallowed. It's praise, the kind you'd give a child. What came back over the next hours changed flavor in a way you could feel through the deck. The Armada's posture softened. Choir hulls that had held a wary review formation breathed outward into something looser, more domestic. The herald began teaching faster, opening tone after tone to Sefu's rig, and the new vocabulary had a theme: shelter, provision, instruction, the placing of a voice within a greater song. They finished the comparison. Sefu reported to the captain's ready room at the end of that watch. I was there to handle the recordings. I stood at the back and watched the senior staff hear it. By their right, the measures have both been sounded. Theirs and ours. The math is done. She checked the rig, though I think she did it to give herself a second, the 11th least voice they have ever measured. They've begun using a new cluster as our name. As best I can render it, it means small, honest voice. Could be worse, Osi said dryly. Could be small, lying voice. What's the consequence? Marsh asked. We've been measured. We're small. What do they do with small? Sefu pulled up a lattice she had been sitting on for an hour, and I watched her decide to stop softening things. They cherish it, she said. That's the horror of it, Captain. There's no cruelty anywhere in this grammar. The rite of tutelage. The lesser voice is taken into the choir of the greater. It is protected from all harm, provisioned forever, instructed in the true song, their sciences, their medicine. Its children are raised knowing their place in the harmony, and its place is permanent, and its voice sings the line it is given, forever. There's no tone in this entire language for a tutelage ending. The relationship doesn't conclude, doesn't graduate, doesn't expire. They're not going to conquer us. She set the rig down. They're going to adopt us. And to them, the difference is everything. And to us, in 100 years, I think there would be no difference at all. The room was quiet. Voss had his eyes closed, listening the way other men read. Timeline, he said. The rubric gives the lesser voice an interval to prepare itself, a ceremonial period. By the herald's phrasing, the interval began when our measure was accepted. She looked around the table. It's 9 of their hours. At the end of it, there's a closing rite. The herald calls it the gathering of the small voice. Their flagship draws alongside, the choirs sing the joining canticle, and emissaries of the new ward are taken aboard the flagship, sung in as the first voices of the tutelage. It's an honor. It's the highest honor their civilization knows how to pay. Taken aboard, Marsh repeated. And the small voice's consent appears in the rubric where exactly? It doesn't. Consent isn't a concept the rite needs. A measure is a fact, Captain. They no more require our consent than a scale requires the consent of the weight. I want to mark this moment plainly, because the histories argue about when the crisis began, and they are all wrong. It did not begin with the boarding craft, hours later. It began here, in a quiet, ready room over lukewarm coffee, when 150 human beings learned that the most generous civilization species had ever encountered intended, with perfect love and no malice, to file us somewhere we would never be permitted to leave, and that refusing was not an outcome their liturgy could parse. Marsh stood options. Run, Osi said. We jump now before their interval expires. Take the data home and let Earth decide the next move with a fleet behind her. And confirm forever that the small voice flees its own measuring, Voss said. We'd be a broken note to them, a heresy on legs. The next contact would not be a rite, it would be a retrieval. No, then refuse, Osi said. Openly sing no. Sefu shook her head. There is no no. I've looked. The closest structure is the tone a voice sings when it disputes its measure, when it claims it was measured wrongly. She stopped. Her own sentence seemed to catch up with her, and her eyes changed. When it claims the measure missed something. Voss opened his eyes. I have spent years now telling this story to debriefing boards and historians, and lately to my grandchildren, and every audience wants the same thing at this point in the telling. They want the War Council. They want grim officers around a red-lit table choosing the hour of the decloak, the speech, the resolve. I am sorry. It was never like that. What happened was that a linguist heard the shape of a door in a dead grammar, and a tired diplomat looked at her across a coffee cup, and the two of them arrived in the same second at the only idea anyone ever had, that the Vethri themselves had built us our one exit, and it was made of their own theology, and to walk through it we would have to do the most dangerous thing imaginable in front of 306 warships. Tell the truth. The rite has a provision for a disputed measure, Sefu said slowly, building it as she spoke. It must. Measures get disputed. Instruments, air. A voice sounds small in a poor chamber. There's a whole tone family for it. The disputing voice declares the error. And then the rite requires. She chased the cluster down, and her face when she found it was the face of a card player turning over the river. Remeasurement. Immediate, formal, binding. The full voice is sounded again, and this time nothing may stand between it and the choir. Whatever was unheard must be heard. And a disputed measure is not a sin. Marsh said. Concealment is their lie, Doctor. We've sat on the veil through their whole sacrament. If we now stand up in church and announce it, that's the wager, Voss said. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, but he had straightened in his chair. Everything turns on which doctrine outranks which. Concealment is sin, but the rite's own rubric, Doctor, you said it yourself in the 6th hour. Hold back nothing is the law of the song. If a voice was withheld, then the first measure was never valid. Not our sin against their rite, a flaw in the rite's own performance, which their law itself demands be corrected. We don't confess, we dispute. We tell them their measurement was wrong because their instrument could not hear us, and we invoke their own sacrament to be measured again. He looked around the table, and for the first time in the entire contact I saw the man's actual age in his face and his actual appetite under it. And this time, we sound everything. They could read it as blasphemy, Safu said. I want that on the record. I'm guessing the precedence of one doctrine over another in an 11,000-year-old liturgy on 9 hours of vocabulary. If I'm wrong about the rubric's rank, the dispute itself is the insult, and they're inside our hull 30 minutes later either way. Noted, Marsh said. Alternatives also noted, be adopted or be hunted. I'll take the blasphemy. She turned to me, and this is where I come back into my own story. Chief Reyes, whisker laser to the veil, my authentication, eyes of Commodore Brand only. Message begins. Contact doctrine compels full reveal under alien rite. Veil squadron to readiness state 2. The cloak only on my transmission of the code word. Code word is lantern light. I say again, lantern light. Weapons tight throughout, no exceptions, no posture. If this goes wrong, and here she paused, the only pause I ever knew her to take, if this goes wrong, you are not to avenge this ship. You are to go home slow and visible, and you are to sing the whole way out. Message ends. I keyed it with my own hand. 11 seconds later, Brandt's acknowledgement came back and appended to it, in the dry shorthand of a woman who had been sitting blind in the ash for 3 weeks with 8,000 crew and no part in any conversation, 3 words of her own. Understood. Singing lessons available. Marsh read it, and for 1 second, I was watching. I had the only other screen. The captain of the Long Patience smiled like a schoolgirl. Then it was gone, and she straightened her jacket and said, Dr. Safu, wake up your choir. We have a measure to dispute. The Vathari did not wait politely while we armed our heresy. Within the hour, the rite itself came looking for us. It began as a brightening on the passive boards, a wash of structured emission rolling out from the armada, slow sphere band over band, gentle as lamplight and thorough as a tide. Sefu identified it from the herald's own teaching tones before it even reached us. The anointing of the small voice, a ceremonial survey sung over a ward before its gathering, the choir's way of learning every seam and scar of the vessel it was about to take into. Its care, a blessing in every sense they meant it. It was also, in every sense my console cared about, the most comprehensive active sensor sweep I had ever seen performed by anyone, and it was expanding through a system in which 41 human warships lay hidden with their reactors breathing through their teeth. Time to the debris ring, I said. Park ran it. Leading edge reaches the shattered moon in 19 minutes. The Karachi and Yellowknife are inside the ring. The destroyer Cordova is. She stopped and rechecked it, and her voice came back smaller. Chief, the Cordova is right in the path of the densest lobe, less than 400 kilometers off the sweep's center line. Our stealth doctrine was good. I will say that plainly, with 30 years of hindsight and every after-action report long since unsealed. The engineers who built the Veil's silence built it to beat instruments, and against instruments it held. But the anointing was not an instrument. It was a hymn with returns, sung by 300 hulls in interlocking intervals, and it did not look for ships. It looked for places where the song came back wrong, and a stealth field, whatever else it does, is a place where the universe answers a half-step flat. I keyed the whisker. Marsh stood over my shoulder and dictated, calm as a Sunday. Veil actual. Ceremonial sweep inbound. Character benign. Fidelity extreme. Recommend all hulls go to full passive, reactors to minimum sustain. Cordova to cease station keeping entirely and drift. Acknowledged by pulse only. 41 acknowledgement pulses came back in 90 seconds. Each one a single soft tick on my board, like rain starting on a roof. Then the system went quieter than it had ever been, and we sat in our lit white frigate, the one thing in Cinder's Gate that was supposed to be seen, and watched the blessing roll over our buried brothers. The sweep crossed the dead planet's orbit. It crossed the inner debris shelf, and 2 of my repeater screens bloomed with the strangest imagery of my career. The Vathari song mapping the ring's 40,000 fragments one by one, tagging each stone with its own answering tone, building a choir out of rubble. Somewhere in that rubble, the Karachi lay with 1,100 souls aboard pretending to be a stone among stones. The sweep's leading edge passed over her position. It paused. I will swear to the pause until I die. 2 full seconds in which nobody on our bridge breathed. and then it moved on, and the pewter herald sang a small bright phrase that Safu, hunched over the rig with her fists clenched, translated in a whisper, "It says the ring is full of old iron. They think." She let out a breath that shook. "They've tagged the wrecks of the moon's collapse. They think our cruisers are part of the ruin." The song found them and filed them as bones. "And the Cordova?" Marsh asked. The densest lobe of the anointing reached the Cordova's driftline 4 minutes later. There was no ring to hide her, no convenient ruin. There was only the doctrine, the cold reactor, the silence, and 312 human beings lying motionless inside a hole in a hymn. The lobe washed across her bow. On my board, the Cordova's whisker transponder, the one system left alive, listening on a thread, registered the sweep's intensity, climbing through every threshold the engineers had certified, then passed them. The song stuttered. That is the only word for it. One voice in the Vethry lattice, a single choir hole on the Armada's near edge, broke it. "Interval," repeated a phrase, and sang a rising tone shape that the rig flagged as interrogative. A question, aimed into the dark, at the precise bearing of a drifting human destroyer. The whole bridge of the Long Patience watched that bearing on the plot like men watching a sleeping dog scent the wind. What saved the Cordova, and this is in no official history, because it embarrassed everyone and flattered no doctrine, was the shattered moon itself. The orbital mechanics of a 9/10 ruined moon are filthy with old violence, stone grinding on stone, fragments ringing one another like struck bells, a constant low clatter of collisions that the Vethari song heard and held and harmonized with as the ordinary voice of a dead place. The questioning hull sang its rising tone twice more at the Cordova's bearing. And then a 12-ton shard of ancient moon, on an orbit nobody planned and nobody could have, clipped a larger fragment 80 kilometers from the destroyer's bow and rang it like a gong, a flat, ugly, natural note, exactly where the anomaly had been scented. The Vethary hull listened to the stone's testimony. It sang a small falling resolution, filed, answered nothing, and returned to its interval, and the anointing rolled on past, and somewhere inside a silent gray hull 400 kilometers away, 312 people learned what their hearts were for. Park sat back from her console with her hands flat on her thighs. "Chief," she said conversationally, "when this is over, I am going to find that rock and kiss it." "Log its orbit," I said. "We owe it a name." We did, too. There is a fragment of the Cinder's Gate moon cataloged today in both species registries under the name we gave it that night, and if you have ever wondered why humanity's first treaty system contains a 12-ton rock formerly designated Sentinel, now the record holds the reason. But the sweep was only the rite's first finger. 40 minutes after the anointing passed its peak, the boards lit again. Small contacts this time, a dozen of them, detaching from the flagship's attendant crescent and forming a slow, ceremonious line astern. Not warships. Each was barely 60 meters, rounded, unarmed so far as any instrument could find, and they advanced toward the Long Patience at a processional crawl, singing as they came a bright, almost childlike canticle that the rig rendered with an entry I have kept framed above my desk for 30 years. Tone family, provision. Subtype, gift. Gift bearers, Safu said. It's in the gathering rubric the ward is provision before it is sung in. They're bringing us. She worked the lattice, and her eyebrows climbed. Food. Compatible organics, synthesized from our own measure song. We sang them our biology in the crew count stanza. Medicines keyed to it. Materials. Captain, they've been manufacturing care packages. 12 unidentified craft on closing vector, O.C. said flatly, from tactical. Is 12 unidentified craft on closing vector? I'm obliged to say it. Say it, Marsh agreed. Then keep your batteries dark. If this ship fires on a casserole, Commander, history will not forgive us, and neither will I. The gift bearers crossed our 100-kilometer line and slowed, opening their formation into a ring, and began, there is no other way to put it, orbiting us. Slowly, gently, at 30 kilometers, 12 singing shuttles wove a wreath around the Long Patience, while their canticle painted our hull with harmless light, and they waited to be told where to set the table. We were being courted, we were being adored, the rig noted, 11 minutes from the optimal dispute window, and the children of the choir were dancing around the ship we were about to use to break their church. Doctor, Marsh said quietly, watching the wreath turn. How long can you stall the table setting without sin? They expect a ward to be shy, Safu said. Hesitancy is in the rubric. It's considered becoming, then will be becoming. The captain settled back into her chair and folded her hands. Chief Reyes, keep the whisker hot. The moment the flagship takes its station, nothing in this system will be becoming ever again. It took Safu 3 hours to build the disputing lattice, and they were the worst 3 hours of the contact, because the Vethari spent them being kind to us. The herald sang teaching tones almost continuously through that interval, gentle, patient structures that the rig identified as preparation hymns, the canticles sung to a small voice before its gathering. Twice, choir hulls detached from the formation and performed slow passes around the long patience, kilometer-long shapes of pewter and gray sliding past our viewports, close enough to read the grain of their grown hulls, and they sang as they passed, and the songs were lullabies. Sifu's rig kept flagging the same recurring cluster in every one of them, and finally she told us what it was. It was our name. Small, honest voice woven into their internal song, already being taught to 306 crews as a note worth keeping. "They're celebrating us," Park said, listening to the hull murmur. "We're about to put a fist through their church window, and they're celebrating us." "Log everything," I told her. "Every note. Whatever happens in the next watch, someone's going to need proof of what they were before." I have never been thanked for that order, but the archive my section recorded in those 3 hours is, I am told, the foundation of 2 universities' worth of Vethery liturgical studies now, so I will thank myself here. Log everything. The first lesson of signals work and the last. At the 7th hour of the 9, the Armada began to move. It was the flagship that moved first, the 11-kilometer mass at the cathedral's heart, the one that had bridled the star. It came out of the formation with a slowness that was itself a kind of grammar, attended by 12 escort hulls in perfect intervallic spacing, and it crossed the system toward us, singing a processional that made every plate in the frigate's bones hum sympathetically, and I watched my crewmates' faces go calm and wet-eyed at their stations even as the threat boards behind their heads quietly redlined. That is a thing the Vethery could do to you that I have never been able to fully explain. The song bypassed the animal in you. The animal saw 11 kilometers of approaching mass and screamed. The song reached past the animal and patted something older, and the 2 truths sat in your chest together, and you wept and checked your firing solutions at the same time. "Time to optimal dispute?" Marsh asked. "The rubric wants the dispute sounded before the joining canticle begins," Sifu said. Her hands were moving across 3 screens at once, assembling the lattice's final measures. "Once they start singing the gathering, interrupting becomes, the cluster is torn song, much worse. I need them closer anyway. The dispute has to be sounded to the keynote himself, not the herald. It has to go to the flagship. How close is close? They'll tell us. The processional ends when the cantor of cantors takes station at the sacred interval, the same 100 kilometers. The moment they stop, we have whatever silence comes before the first canticle note. That silence is the door. We sound the dispute inside it, or we don't sound it at all. The flagship and its 12 attendants cross the orbit of the dead planet. On my boards, behind and around and beneath that procession, I now held something none of the histories ever convey properly. The whole rest of the picture. 300-odd choir hulls holding their cathedral, 12 escorts in liturgical interval, 1 frigate, white and slate, alone on the altar, and threaded invisibly through 40 positions in the system's ash and debris, 41 human warships at readiness state 2, weapons tight, reactors breathing shallow, waiting on one word for my key. I have been asked many times what that felt like, holding all of it on one scope. It felt like watching a wedding from the bell tower, knowing the bells were loaded. At 30,000 kilometers, the flagship's song changed. The processional shed its layers one by one, voices dropping away with each interval crossed, until at the last crossing it was a single voice alone, one tone, impossibly deep, the gravimetric keynote itself, the reference pitch of an 11,000-year song. The cantor of cantors, singing his own presence plain. The flagship took station at 100 kilometers, precise to the meter. The 12 escorts spread into a crescent. The herald withdrew to the formation's edge like a verger stepping back from the rail, and the silence came down. I want to describe that silence properly, because I have heard silence on every band there is, and this was none of them. 306 hulls stopped singing at once, and the system's whole spectrum went flat, flatter than empty space ever reads, because empty space at least carries the universe's old static hiss, and they had somehow hushed even that, damped it, the way a cathedral stone swallows the street outside. A silence that was itself performed. The held breath before the first note of a canticle that had been sung over every gathered species for 11,000 years and had never once been interrupted. "Dr. Marsh said quietly." Sifu's hand came down on the rig, and the long patience sang into that engineered silence the rudest sentence in the history of our species. The lattice went out in their own grammar, built from their own taught tones, and rendered back into words it said. The measure of the small voice is disputed. The measuring was flawed. A voice was present that your instrument did not hear. By the law of the song, hold back nothing, the rite is unfulfilled. The small voice invokes remeasurement. Hear what was not heard. For 3 full seconds, nothing in the system moved. Then the spectrum convulsed. 306 voices came up at once, and they were not singing. For the first time in the whole contact, the Vethery produced sound with no Harmony in it at all, tone slashing across tone, a squall of pure dissonance that made Park rip her headset off and that I rode at full gain because somebody had to. The rig's translation pane filled and crashed and filled again, fragments, shouts, liturgical machinery seizing. The cluster for error, the cluster for unheard, and rising through the squall, picked up and repeated from choir to choir like a fire running down a pew, a cluster Safu had prayed we would not hear, the one that shared its root with lie, concealment within the rite. The 12 escort hulls moved. The crescent contracted around the flagship, a shield posture, instinctive, ancient. And across the cathedral formation behind them I watched 300 drives flare to readiness in the same second, the entire armada coming up from worship to war footing inside a single human heartbeat. Whatever the Vithari were, they had not survived 11,000 years by being slow. The keynote sounded, alone, enormous, the flagship's one deep voice driving down through the squall, and the squall died around it the way surf dies under oil, order restored by a single tone. Then the cantor of cantors sang 3 short phrases, and Sefu read them off the pane as they landed, her voice absolutely level in the way of someone walking a rope and refusing to look down. First phrase, the dispute is heard. Form acknowledged, we used the rubric correctly. Second phrase, the claim is, the nearest tone is impossible. No voice is present, that the choir is not heard. The choir hears everything. Third phrase, she paused, one beat, and on the pane the lattice resolved, and she finished, sound this hidden voice now, or the small voice is in torn song, and the gathering proceeds upon it. Marsh didn't ask for translation of the last clause. Nobody needed it. She looked at me, and the bridge of the long patience went very still, and out in the ash on 41 dark hulls, 8,000 of our people sat with their hands flat on cold consoles waiting for the only word I have ever sent that mattered. Chief Reyes, the captain said, Lantern Light, I keyed it. Lantern Light had a choreography. Brandt and Marsh had built it together across 3 weeks of whisker laser traffic, refined it twice during the contact itself, and the order of operations was the entire message, designed to be read correctly by a civilization we had known for 2 days. First, running lights. Not weapons, not drives, not active sensors, lights. At my keystroke, in 41 places across the Cinder's Gate system, navigation and formation lighting snapped on, amber and white, outlining each hull in the dark. A warship's running lights are the one system aboard that exists purely to say, here I am. We lit ourselves the way ships have announced themselves on dark water for 3,000 years. Second, 3 seconds later, transponders. 41 identification codes broadcast in the clear on the contact band, name, mass, class, crew complement, the same data fields, in the same order that the long patience had sung for itself in our little measure. The format was the message. We are not new things. We are more of the same thing, telling you the same truths. Third, the stealth fields themselves, dropped in sequence, hull by hull, not all at once, Brandt's idea and pure cold genius. An instantaneous mass decloak reads as an ambush sprung. A sequence reads as a roll call. One by one, a half-second apart, like voices answering a muster, 41 human warships stopped being holes in the universe and became iron facts in it. The destroyers first, lean gray wedges lying among the debris fields and dead moons. Then the cruisers Karachi and Yellowknife, long-hulled and turreted, rising gently out of the shattered moon's ring where they had drifted as cold rocks for 19 days. And last, deliberately last, the carrier Resolute Dawn, 1,100 meters of flight decks and scarred plating, lighting up not 200 kilometers from the Vethari flagship's own stern, inside the Escort Crescent, in the blind spot of the holiest vessel of an 11,000-year faith. And then, fourth, and most important, the step Marsh had ordered written into the plan before any other step existed. Nothing. No drives. No maneuvering. No targeting emissions. The fire control systems of all 41 ships stayed dark, and that was not theater. The magazines were locked down under triple key. The Veil Squadron simply lay where it had lain all along, lit and named and motionless, holding the exact positions it had held in secret for 19 days. Because that, Marsh said, was the testimony. Any fleet can arrive. Only a fleet that was already here can prove what it did not do while it waited. I had the privilege of watching 306 warships of the Vethari Ascendancy understand all of this in real time. The spectrum did not convulse the way it had at the dispute. What happened was in its way more terrible. The armada went silent again. But this silence was not performed, not liturgical, not anything. It was involuntary. It was 306 voices stopping mid-tone because the minds behind them had lost the thread of an 11,000-year song. Safu's rig, trained now on their grammar, put a label on the silence that I will carry to my grave. The pane read, in its flat machine font, no structure detected. For 1 minute and 40 seconds, the choir that measures had nothing to say. I used the time the way a signals man does. I watched the data. I watched 12 escort hulls discover the resolute dawn behind their flagship and not move because their doctrine had no maneuver filed for it. Every defensive pattern they owned assumed the threat announces itself by arriving, and this threat had announced itself by having already arrived, weeks ago unheard, and electing to do nothing with it. I watched their formation keeping waver, hulls drifting whole meters off their sacred intervals, which Sifu would tell me later was the Vethari equivalent of a cathedral full of clergy forgetting the words to the oldest prayer they knew. And I watched on the optical feed the nearest choir hull to the cruiser Yellowknife slowly rotate in place, not toward a firing aspect, but the way a man turns to stare. They were looking. With everything they had in every band they owned, 306 temples were looking at 41 quiet gray ships, and the instruments that heard everything were being told by their own returns that the universe had been lying to them for 19 days. Then the keynote came back. One tone, deep and alone, but I had logged enough hours on that voice by now to hear what the whole bridge heard, what even crew with no headset and no rig heard through the murmuring plates of the hull. It wavered. The reference pitch of the Vethari ascendancy, the note against which a civilization tuned itself, came up out of that broken silence almost a full degree flat and corrected itself mid-breath, and the correction was audible across 4 light seconds to a species that had known these beings for 51 hours. The histories spend chapters on the decloak. They spend a sentence on the flat keynote. They have it backwards. Ships are ships. I heard a god clear its throat. The cantor of cantors sang one short phrase. Sifu, read the pain and read it again. And when she spoke, there was something between awe and grief in her voice, because she alone among us heard the question in the original, with all its harmonic freight, and she has said since that no translation will ever carry it whole. What the pain said was, why did the strong voice sing small, not a challenge? Not an accusation. The grammar of accusation was right there in their language, she said, ready to hand, and he had not used it. The cantor of cantors had asked his question in the tone family the Vethari reserved for catechism, the form a student uses before a teacher, the form in which the herald had corrected our infant notes 50 hours ago. The oldest voice in the gathered galaxy, standing amid the wreck of his own sacrament with a human carrier parked silent in his blind spot, had reached for the grammar of a pupil. Voss stepped to the center of the bridge. He had not slept, I think, in 2 days. His collar was open, and on the repeater screen I could see his hands trembling very slightly at his sides, the body keeping honest books while the voice balanced them. He spoke quietly to Sifu, plain words for the lattice, and what he gave her was short enough that I can set it down whole, and famous enough now that you will have heard it carved over doorways. But I heard it spoken first, on a quiet bridge, by a tired man. Sing back. The strong voice sang small, because it hoped small would be enough. Among our kind, strength unspent is the only gift that costs the giver nothing and the receiver less. We did not hide our fleet from you. We hid it from the moment in case the moment never needed it. That is our measure, not the ships, the waiting. Sifu built it into their grammar with shaking hands, and she added, she confessed this to the review board afterward, and the board, reading the outcome, declined to so much as note it, one structure of her own invention at the close. A cadence assembled from their tone for unspent strength and their tone for offering. A chord that did not exist in 11,000 years of Vethari song until a human linguist built it in the ash of Cinder's Gate. The closest she could render it in words was a held note given as a gift. The lattice went out. 100 kilometers away, the holiest being of a civilization older than our written history listened to a species 51 hours old in his sky teach him a chord. What broke the silence next was not the keynote, it was the choirs. Far back in the cathedral formation, 2 small hulls, escorts of no liturgical rank, whose crews can never have been told what to do, because what they did had never happened before and there was no rubric anywhere for it. They sang Sifu's chord back, hesitant, half a beat apart, the way a congregation tries an unfamiliar hymn, a held note given as a gift. Then 4 more hulls took it up, then a wing of them, then a whole choir line, the new chord moving through the armada like wind crossing a wheat field, and Sifu stood in the middle of our bridge with her hand over her mouth, listening to 306 warships learn to sing something human. The cantor of cantors let them sing it. That fact alone, their own scholars have since written, was the true end of the old doctrine. The keynote, permitting an unsanctioned tone to live inside the eternal song. When at last his voice came down through it, it did not silence the chord. It joined it, took the root of it, lifted it, and built upon Sifu's little human cadence a vast formal structure that the rig labored over and finally rendered onto the pane in words that stopped. Every conversation on our bridge, the rite of measure is torn and cannot be sung over you. No instrument of ours can weigh a voice that holds itself unsung. That gathering will not proceed. The small voice is not small, and was never small, and the choir that measures has today been measured. Park beside me, exhaled for what sounded like the first time in an hour, and said to no one in particular, in the dazed, flat voice of a woman reporting instrument readings, "Confirm all the IR systems standing down, all of them. Sir, 306 hulls just went weapons cold simultaneously." "Match it," Marsh said instantly. "Signal the veil. Stand down readiness, state 2, keep the lights on, and somebody get the envoy a chair." That is what Doctrine collapse looks like from the inside, in case you have ever wondered. No explosions, no last stand. A flat keynote, a borrowed chord, 800 years of human naval nerve compressed into one held breath, and then across 4 light seconds of dead system, the sound of the largest fleet either of our species ever assembled in peacetime, quietly uncocking its guns to the music of a linguist's improvised hymn. The hours immediately after the stand down, the first hours of what both fleets would come to call the quiet, are the ones I find hardest to tell, because nothing in them would film well, and everything in them mattered. Begin with the gift bearers. The 12 had been holding their wreath around us through the entire dispute, the decloak, the keynote's flat note, the chord, a ring of singing shuttles built for a ceremony that no longer existed, orbiting a ward that had just unmade the entire category of ward. For several minutes after the great stand down, nobody on either side seemed to remember them. Then a recall tone sounded from the flagship, and 11 of the 12 broke their wreath and processed back toward the crescent, their canticle dimming to something Sifu's rig tagged, heartbreakingly, as uncertainty. The 12th did not leave. It hung at 30 kilometers off our beam, silent for a long moment, and then it sang a short, hesitant lattice on low power, addressed not to the flagship, not to the formation, but to us, and Sifu worked it and put her hand over her eyes and laughed the kind of laugh that is mostly relief and partly something breaking, gently. "It's asking," she said, "whether we would still like the food." The reply Voss authorized is preserved in the contact archive, time-stamped 4 minutes later, and I would set it against any of the day's grander lattices. Yes, with gratitude. The gift is welcome between equal voices. The 12th gift-bearer crossed our bow, matched velocity, and delivered to the Long Patience's ventral bay 3 tons of synthesized provisions, the first physical objects ever exchanged between our species. And the manifest of that pallet is taught to school children now, but I watched the bay crew unpack it live on an internal feed, big men in vacuum gear going still one by one as they realized the Vathari had not only synthesized human-compatible rations from a sung genome, they had attempted presentation, arrangements, garnish after a fashion, in mineral filigree. Somewhere in that armada of 306 warships, in the worst diplomatic hour of their civilization's memory, some Vathari crew had plated the food. They were never going to be our enemies, Park said, watching the feed over my shoulder. We just spent 3 weeks making sure of something that was never true. We spent 3 weeks making sure, I said, because the last 117 species who guessed couldn't unguess. Don't apologize for the rifle you didn't need, Lieutenant. It's the only way you ever get to find out you didn't need it. I have repeated that line for 30 years, and I still believe it, but I will confess here what I did not say to her. My hands had not fully steadied for 2 watches. And when I came off shift that night, I sat on the edge of my rack for a long time with the lights off, listening to the hull, the way you listen for a child's breathing after a fever is broken. The fleet spent the quiet learning each other at a rate I still find hard to credit. Brandt's squadron stayed lit and stayed put. Marsh and the Commodore agreed within an hour that recloaking now would read as a withdrawal of testimony, and so for the first time in the contact, the Vathari could simply look at us, all of us, and they did. Choir hulls drifted off their stations in 2s and 3s to perform slow, deferential passes along the Vale's lattice, singing observation canticles over each human ship in turn, and the human crews, cooped in silence for 3 weeks with nothing to do but maintain firing solutions they hoped never to use, discovered all at once that they were allowed to wave back. The signal discipline of 41 warships disintegrated into the most cheerfully unprofessional traffic I ever had the honor of failing to suppress. The destroyer Cordova transmitted the full text of its name's history to a curious choir hull, complete with the story of the rock called Sentinel. The Karachi's galley, God help us all, sent a recipe, and the Resolute Dawn's flight wing requested, through channels with Brandt's signature on the request, because the Commodore understood to her bones what was being built in those hours. Permission to fly a formation demonstration for their hosts. 40 fighters in a slow lattice weave down the length of the armada, lights on, weapons safed and announced as safed in good Vathari grammar. I keyed that request to Marsh, expecting a veto. She read it twice, looked out the viewport at the cathedral for a moment and said, "Approved," and signaled the flagship first. Tell them what they're about to see. Tell them it's how small voices sing about joy. The fighters flew it at the turn of the watch. 306 warships of the Vethari Ascendancy watched 40 single-seat craft braid themselves down 400 kilometers of formation, like sparrows stitching a hedgerow, and when the wing pulled up and scattered at the end in a deliberately ragged, deliberately human bloom of disorder, the youngest choir sang the chord back at them, a held note, given as a gift, and appended a new tone shape of their own invention that Sefu's rig struggled with for 10 minutes before rendering, with low confidence, a translation that her institute has never improved upon. Do it again. I want one more thing in the record of the quiet, because no one else will put it there. Late in my last watch of that rotation, a courier drone came through the violet seam from the direction of home. The first word from Earth since the contact began, dispatched on the strength of our earliest reports, before anyone back there knew about the measure, the dispute, the decloak, any of it. It carried contingency instructions from the Admiralty in 17 sealed layers, and Marsh sat with the envoy and opened them one by one in the ready room while I logged the seals. I am permitted to describe only the last layer, declassified 20 years ago with the rest. After 16 layers of doctrine for 16 grades of catastrophe, withdrawal protocols, deterrence postures, the unthinkable arithmetic of exchange ratios against an unknown fleet, the 17th and final layer, the one marked for the case no planner could plan, contained a single sheet, hand-signed by the first Sea Lord of a Navy 400 years old, and the sheet said, "If all else is unclear, be worth meeting." Marsh read it aloud once, set it down, and looked out the ready room viewport at 306 alien warships learning a human chord. "Well," she said. Late but accurate. Voss raised his coffee an inch in salute. "Send back the only honest after-action report in naval history," he said. 3 words. Orders anticipated. Complied. I would like to tell you it ended there, on the chord. It nearly did. The histories that stop there are only one watch short of honest. It was Park who caught it, 14 hours later, during what the two fleets had settled into calling the quiet, a long mutual drift in which Sifu's section and the Vethari heralds traded vocabulary like fishermen trading knots, and the rest of us stood watches that felt, for the first time in days, almost ordinary. She was running routine passes over the Armada when she sat up straight and said, "Chief, choir line on the cathedral's far edge. Count me those drive signatures." I counted. 22 hulls, and every one of them warming. Not the soft station-keeping flicker the rest of the Armada showed. These were combat drives breathing up toward power, and as I watched, the 22 began to slide out of the sacred intervals, contracting into a tight wedge of their own, and their voices dropped out of the common song. They went silent the way we had been silent. That was the message, and everyone on both sides read it at once. Sefu had names for them within the hour, pulled from heralds who answered her questions with a new tone in their lattices, embarrassment, she judged, or something adjacent to shame. The 22 were the choir of the unbroken measure, an old order, a proud one, keepers of the rite's strictest line, with 11,000 years of doctrine in their keeping and a simple position on the day's events. The measure was not torn. Their cantor sang to the whole formation, and the rig caught it all. It was defiled. The hidden fleet was not a revelation but a heresy confessed. The keynote has sung error. The unbroken measure does not. And what does the unbroken measure do? Marsh asked quietly. When the keynote sings error? There's no precedent, Sefu said. The keynote hasn't been disputed in, she checked and laughed once, without any humor in it, ever. It's never happened. We broke their measure yesterday, Captain. I think today we're watching the first schism in the recorded history of their species, and I think the 22 intend to resolve it by erasing the cause. The wedge completed its turn. 22 combat-warm hulls, silent and accelerating gently, bows aligned on one small white frigate. What happened in the next 11 minutes is taught now, I am told, at every war college we have, usually under some title like restraint as escalation dominance, which is the kind of name people give a thing when they were not on the bridge while it happened. I will tell it the way I logged it. Minute 1, Marsh ordered the long patience to hold position and sent one sentence to Commodore Brandt. Weapons stay tight, propose response. The flagship of the Vethari sounded the keynote with an edge on it we had never heard. A command tone, the rig said, ordering the 22 back to interval. The 22 did not answer. Their silence was their answer. They had learned it from us. Minute 3. Brandt's reply came over the whisker, and I keyed her plan to the captain's repeater and watched Marsh read it twice and authorize it without changing a word. I will quote the operative line because 8,000 people executed it flawlessly, and they deserve to have it remembered exactly. Propose we answer silence with arithmetic. Minute 4, the V squadron moved for the first time in 20 days. Not toward the 22. That was the heart of it. The 41 came up off their stations in the ash and the rings and the dead orbits. Drives lit, lights blazing, and they moved into formation. A single open lattice, spaced wide across the system between the wedge and nothing in particular, every gun still cold, every fire control system still dark. And as each human ship settled into its slot, it transmitted in the clear on the contact band. In good Vethari grammar, Sefu's section had been feeding the squadron vocabulary for 2 days, a short lattice of pure data. Each ship sang the position it had held in secret, the date it had taken that position 19 days past. And then, this was the arithmetic. Each ship sang a list, the hulls of the choir of the unbroken measure by name, as logged and tracked and solved from that position on that date. 22 names, sung 41 times in 41 interlocking voices, every ship now accelerating toward our frigate had been held continuously, in 41 quiet firing ledgers since before the Armada knew humanity owned a second ship. The lattice carried no threat tone. Sefu had stripped every shade of menace out of the grammar at Brant's specific request. It was sung in the tone family of testimony, the form for entering facts into the song's record. Here is where we were, here is when, here is what we saw of you, all of you, every day, the whole time. And appended to it, the cadence already older than the schism had answered, the chord every hull in 2 fleets now knew, a held note, given as a gift. Minute 9, the 22 cut their drives. I was on the optical feed when the wedge broke. It did not scatter. Nothing the Vethari did was ever ragged. It folded, the formation collapsing inward like a fist opening into a hand, and then the 22 hulls turned, slow and deliberate, presenting their broadsides to the system in a maneuver Sefu's heralds identified, in lattices that shook with what the rig could only render as enormity as the bared throat. A posture out of their deepest liturgical memory, sung but never performed in living record, the choir's oldest gesture of submission, total, unconditional, offered not to the keynote but, and the heralds were explicit, and the recordings are public, and I still read the line sometimes to make sure it says what it says. To the small voice and its unsung measure. Minute 11. The keynote sounded over all of it, and the 22 voices of the choir of the unbroken measure came back into the eternal song one by one, flat with grief, retuned, lowest in the harmony, and the schism that should have lasted 1,000 years was over before the watch changed. They could not fight us. I want to be precise about why, because the war colleges get it nearly right and then miss the floor of it. It was not fear, or not mostly fear. It was that their entire civilization was a theology of measurement, and we had become unmeasurable. Every doctrine they owned for war assumed an enemy whose strength sounds itself, arrives, postures, declares. Humanity's strength had spent 3 weeks demonstrating that it does not arrive. It is discovered, already in place, already patient, already certain, and asking for nothing. You cannot sound your measure against a voice that proves the dark itself might be full of it, quietly wishing you well. The 22 were the bravest of their kind, and the bravest of their kind looked into 41 cold gun ledgers and the warm cord appended to them, and understood that the only move on the board was to trust that the new thing meant what it sang. That evening, I call it evening. The Ember gave no evenings, the watchbill did. Envoy Voss came down to the signals shack in person, which envoys do not do, and stood in the hatch looking older than the trip out had made him, and said, "Chief Reyes, the flagship has invited a delegation aboard." Not a gathering, they've struck that word for us permanently, the doctor tells me. The lattice they sent is a new structure. Their heralds don't have a name for it yet. What's it say, sir? It says, "Come and stand where the song is kept, and teach us the rest of the chord." He smiled very slightly into his beard. "The captain asked for you on the shuttle. Her reasoning is that somebody has to carry the radio, but between us, Chief, I believe she wants the man who keyed lantern light to hear what it bought." Before any human boarded their flagship, a Vethari came aboard ours. The histories give this visit a paragraph. It deserves a chapter, and since I stood the airlock watch for it, it will get one here. The request arrived 2 watches after the schism folded, sung not by the flagship but by the pewter herald, our first voice, the ship that had taught us our notes, and the lattice was unlike anything Sefu had processed before, because it was phrased in the first-person singular. The Vethari barely used it. Their grammar ran in choirs. An individual voice asking for an individual thing was so rare that the rig initially flagged the structure as an error. It was not an error. The herald, not the herald's ship, the herald, a single being, the cantor of that small pewter hull, was asking permission to cross to the long. Patience and stand inside the small voice. Alone. The flagship hasn't endorsed it, Sefu reported. That's not exactly right. The flagship has pointedly not commented on it. I think this is personal. This cantor has spent the entire contact closer to us than any being of their species, I think. She hesitated, choosing the human word with a translator's care. I think it needs to see us. 3rd assessment, Marsh asked Osi, pro forma. One unarmed being, 60-meter unarmed boat, inside a system where its civilization already has us outmassed 40,000 to 1. O.C. shrugged. If it's a trick, Captain, it's a trick we lost 3 weeks ago. Then render honors, Marsh said. Side party at the forward lock. And Chief, she found me at my boards. You have the watch on the lock. If the first Vithari aboard a human ship says something, I want it heard by the best ears I have. The Herald's boat made the crossing in 40 minutes and made it to our forward lock with a precision that made our docking system's corrections log read as a flat line. What came through the lock when it cycled I have already half described: the pewter surfaces, the 6 limbs, the height of a tall man, and the presence of something much larger. But no instrument log conveys what it was like when the being stepped over human threshold, paused, and sang very softly into the metal of our deck. I had my gear trained, naturally. The tone was nearly subsonic, gentle, repeated 3 times with small variations, and the rig rendered it while the side party stood at attention with their bosun's calls still raised. Greeting tone, addressed not to the crew, not to the captain, addressed to the ship. The Herald was introducing itself to the long patience, hull to hull, the only protocol it owned. And our frigate, 11 years old, scarred by micrometeorites and 2 careless tenders, answered the way steel answers. A faint sympathetic ring in the deck plating, meaningless, mere physics, and the Herald received that meaningless ring with a small completing tone, a satisfied resolution, as if the introduction had been accepted. Sefu, watching my feed from the bridge, said quietly into my ear, "Whatever you do, don't tell it the ship wasn't talking. As far as our guest is concerned, it just met us properly for the first time. We walked the Herald through the ship. That was its whole request. To walk, to stand inside the rooms, to hear the small voice from within, and so a being of the Vethari ascendancy spent 4 hours moving slowly down the passageways of a Terran frigate while off-watch crew pressed themselves respectfully against the bulkheads and then, increasingly, failed to. By the 2nd hour, there was a procession. By the 3rd, the procession had a character I can only call a county fair moving in reverse. Humans showing things. A machinist's mate showed at the torpedo room. Marsh had ruled in one of the great judgment calls of the contact that nothing aboard would be closed to it. Nothing. Because the whole grammar of the relationship now ran on, held back nothing. And the Herald stood among the lockdown weapons it had never been permitted to detect and sang a long, low tone that the rig labeled simply grief-adjacent respect. The galley fed it. It could not eat our food, but it lowered a limb into the steam rising off a soup kettle and held it there, reading the heat like a page of print, and sang the brightness tone it had used for joy. And in the forward observation bay, where the off-watch had hung 4 decades of unit patches, family photographs, and 1 Karachi recipe card, the Herald stopped for a long time before the wall of pictures. Children, mostly, the crew's children, looking out at the dead system their parents had crossed the dark to stand in, and asked Sifu, through the portable rig, its only question of the entire visit. "These are your small voices." "Yes," Sefu said, "and you brought their images into the unmeasured dark, to a meeting you could not weigh." The Herald's tones came slow and very careful, an old being walking on new ice. "The choir would not have done this. An image carried into hazard is a hostage given to grief. Why do you carry them?" And Sefu, who told me afterward that every philosophy course she ever sat through stampeded across her mind in that moment, and that she let them all go by, answered with the plain truth the way the plain truth is told below decks, because that's who the guns are cold for. The Herald stood before the wall of children for 11 more minutes. It did not sing. The rig recorded, instead, the lowest amplitude emission of the entire contact, a tone below its own hearing, below ours, a vibration the deck barely carried, which Sefu's Institute spent a decade analyzing and finally, in a paper I am too old to pretend I fully follow, identified as a fragment of the eternal song itself, 11,000 years old, the oldest line in their liturgy, sung at the volume of a heartbeat to a corkboard of photographs from a species it had known for 6 days. Their word for what changed at Cinder's Gate is usually translated doctrine collapse, and the war colleges teach the decloak, and the historians teach the chord, and the diplomats teach the concord. But I stood the lock watch. I saw the actual instant with my own eyes, and I will put it in the record here at the end of my competence, and let the scholars argue. The Vithari ascendancy changed its mind about humanity in the forward observation bay of the Long Patience in front of the crew's photo wall, somewhere in those 11 silent minutes, between a question their civilization had never thought to ask and an answer ours had never needed to write down. When the Herald's boat detached and fell away toward the Armada, it sang the 3 descending notes one final time at our hull, and then, alone on its own small voice, unsanctioned by any flagship, it added our 2 rising ones. The watch logs note that signal strength was poor. The watch logs are correct. It was not singing for transmission, it was practicing. 2 days later, the invitation to the flagship came, and Voss appeared in the hatch of my signals shack, and the rest you have already heard me begin. I will not try to give you the interior of the Vethari flagship at full length, because I have tried before and the words come back insufficient, like photographs of a canyon. I will give you what a signals man kept. The shuttle crossing took 2 hours, our little boat running a corridor of choir halls that sang us through, passing us voice to voice like a melody handed down a line of bells. The flagship swallowed us through a hull that opened without seam or hinge, the grown material simply parting, and we came inside a vessel that had no straight lines anywhere in it. Vethari stand about the height of a tall man, but read larger, slow-moving. Radially built, 6 limbs and no face you could fix on, their surface is the same seamless pewter as their hulls, and they do not speak. The body is the instrument. Standing among them in the resonance halls of that ship, you heard their conversation through your own ribcage, and after the first hour you stopped trying to listen with your ears at all, and after the second hour, Sifu swears, some of us had begun answering in posture without knowing it. They brought us to the keep of the song. I had imagined a throne room or a bridge. It was neither. It was the bottom of a well of galleries a kilometer deep, every gallery ringed with singers, and at the floor of it, alone, the cantor of cantors, larger than the others, old in a way you felt on your skin, his surfaces crazed with hairline scars like the glaze of an ancient cup. The keynote at conversational volume is a thing I will never recover from and never wish to. What happened there took 11 hours and became the spine of the Concord of the Ember, and the negotiators can keep the credit for the clauses. I kept 3 moments. The first. Early in the proceedings, the cantor of cantors sang a long structure that Sifu rendered for the record, her voice cracking at the center of it, an accounting. He sang the count of species the rite of measure had gathered into tutelage across 11,000 years, 117, and then he sang the count of those that had ever afterward left it, which the rubric did not permit and the harmony did not require, and that count was the empty tone, the null, the figure their music kept for nothing. 117 small voices, cherished and provisioned and held forever, and he sang it not in pride, which is how every prior generation of his office had sung it, but in the tone family of inventory, a keeper counting what is in the vault, hearing for the first time how the count sounds when a new chord is set beside it. Then he asked Voss, in the catechism form, the pupils form, the second question a Vethari had ever asked humanity. When the strong voice waits in the dark beside a small one, and the moment never comes, what does it do with the strength? And Voss, who had no linguist's caution left in him by then and spoke straight into the lattice, said, "It grows old and tells lies about how big the fish was, and is buried with its gun still locked. That's the whole trick of us. Most of our strength is never spent. It just stands the watch and rusts and counts itself lucky." The galleries sang that answer among themselves for a long time, buried with its gun still locked, moving up the well of voices, gallery to gallery, being turned over the way the sea turns a stone. Their scholars, I am told, are turning it over still. The second moment, the signing itself, or what stood for one. No paper, no pens. The Concord was sung into the eternal song, a new movement composed jointly, the first in their history, with a second species voice written into the score as an equal line rather than a gathered one. The terms rendered flat, peace, borders flagged and mutual, exchange of heralds, no tutelage. The word itself retired from use towards humanity forever. And one clause the Vethari insisted upon over our negotiators' puzzlement, a clause with no precedent on either side. The veil clause, the histories call it. The ascendancy formally requested that humanity never disclose the full count of its fleets, to them or to anyone, not because they feared the number. Sifu spent a week confirming the grammar before anyone believed it. They wanted the dark to stay full. An 11,000-year-old civilization that had measured everything it ever met had discovered, 2 weeks into knowing us, that it preferred a universe holding one voice it would never finish hearing, that the unmeasured thing, kept gentle, was the only hymn they had never owned, and they would rather wonder at it than weigh it. The cantor of cantors sealed the conquered by doing the unprecedented thing, the thing that made the priests of 200 client species rewrite their books. He retuned the keynote. The reference pitch of the ascendancy, unchanged across 11 millennia, was shifted 1 degree, the same single degree by which his herald had once corrected our infant notes in the 6th hour of contact, so that the eternal song would carry forever, in its very foundation, the interval of Sifu's chord. A held note, given as a gift, built into the floor of a civilization. They do not have monuments. That is what they raised instead. And the third moment was not aboard the flagship at all. It came later, at the leave-taking, and it is the one I am actually here to set down, because I have never once seen it in the histories, and I logged it myself, so let the record finally hold it. The armada left Cinder's Gate the way it had come, choir by choir, the cathedral dissolving outward into the violet seam, every departing voice handing its line to the next, until the last haul through was the pewter herald, the first voice we ever answered, and it paused at the threshold and sang 3 notes, descending, the same 3 that had opened everything, and then 2 more, rising. Our 2. The continuation Sifu had sent back in the first hour returned to us across the whole arc of the contact like a borrowed coat at a door. Then it was gone and the seam closed and the system was ash and ember and silence again. The long patience came about for home. And on my boards, one by one, in no ceremony at all, the Vale Squadron's 41 transponders began winking out. Brant taking her ships back under stealth for the long passage, standard doctrine, nothing sentimental in it. But she let the carrier go dark last, and before the resolute dawn folded itself back into the silence it had kept so well, her signal lamp, the oldest instrument on the oldest band there is, light itself, blinked by hand, flashed across 40,000 kilometers at our bridge, at Marsh, at all of us, a single phrase in plain service code. I read it off the glass myself out loud, to the only bridge in the human fleet that would have understood every layer of it. Well sung. Going quiet. Then the dark was just the dark again, full in the way only we knew, and we burned for home. That was 31 years ago. Sifu has her institute now, and the chord has a name in their song and ours. And there are human heralds standing watches in resonance halls 1,000 light years up the ascendancy's spine, learning to talk with their ribs. Marsh is gone, 6 years past, buried at sea off a world she helped keep boring. The cantor of cantors outlived her and sang, our embassy says, a held note for her, alone unrecorded in the keep of the song the night the news arrived. Voss went last spring. I am the last of the 7 who knew, the last hand that was on that key, and the boards I watch these days are a porch rail and a coastline and the weather coming in. People ask me, the historians, the grandchildren, the occasional young officer who makes the drive out, what humanity really showed them at Cinder's Gate. They expect ships. Sometimes they expect the chord. And I tell them what I logged, because a signals man answers from the record. We showed them a species that brought overwhelming force to the most important meeting in its history, and then bet everything. The ship, the crew, the whole long human argument on never having to mention it. The fleet was real. The guns were real. But the measure of us was 19 days of silence with our finger nowhere near the trigger and one small ship in the open, talking. Any species can fill the dark with warships. We filled it with patience, and let them find out for themselves what was holding its breath out there on our behalf. And when they finally saw it, every light was on, every gun was cold, and it had been waiting there the whole time with nothing in its hands. That is what they could not measure. Not the size of the fleet, the size of the restraint. The Vetharies sing 11,000 years deep, and they will be singing when our sun is a cinder like the ember, and somewhere in the floor of all of it, forever, is 1 degree of human patience. Hold the note. Give it as a gift. It was never the ships that filled the dark, it was us.